after I was done with Dominion, I turned to his book Rubicon, which I read, and then I listened to his book Dynasty, and I realized I'd done this all in the wrong order. I should have started with Rubicon, then gone to Dynasty, then gone to Dominion. But I asked him to come back and talk with me about Rome. Tom Holland, welcome back. It's great to have you. Where do we find you this morning?
You find me in lockdown in my house in London.
Uh,
Still not really allowed to leave it, unfortunately.
I'm sorry to hear that. Are you working hard on a book?
Oh, yeah. I must be one of the few people for whom lockdown has actually given me an enormous spike in productivity because I'm getting so much done.
Well, I've got to tell you, I want people to read Rubicon and Dynasty as I want them to read Dominion because there's nothing new under the sun. Plagues, famines, fires. We're living through a plague, but it's not like Rome didn't have their share of them through their many centuries run, correct?
Absolutely correct. In fact, there's a case for saying that the Roman Empire was the first great incubator of pandemics because it was a kind of intersection point between the plagues that brewed in the middle of Africa and the plagues that brewed in the middle of Asia. And they would come eastwards and they would come northwards and they would hit the massive cities of the Roman Empire, Rome, Alexandria, and so on. And they just spread like wildfire. And there'd never been an experience of disease quite like it.
Now, some people will wonder, why am I talking about Rome, which is thousands of years ago? And I like to tell them, D.C., Washington, D.C. is the new Rome. London was Rome. Berlin wanted to be Rome. Beijing has never even believed there could be a Rome. But we always talk in reference to Rome. Why is that, Tom Holland?
Well, I think that the United States of America is probably more haunted by the ghost of Rome than any other country. And the reason for that is that, in a way, the history of Rome inspired the creation of America, because the founding fathers would read in their Roman historians how the ancient Romans had been ruled by a king, and then in the name of liberty, they had thrown the king out, and they had established a republic with a senate, with a great temple on a hill called the Capitol. They'd filled their city with amazing columns and pediments and so on. And this provided the founding fathers with the model of what they wanted, the kind of republic that they hoped to found. But if Rome had been an inspiration to the founding fathers, it was also a terrible warning, because in the long run, the republic collapsed, and an autocracy was founded on the rubble of that republic, the autocracy of the Caesars. And then, of course, centuries on, the Roman Empire itself fell. And there's a sense in which the United States, perhaps more than any other country in the world, is haunted by those two calamities: the calamity of the collapse of Republican freedom and then the collapse of Rome itself.
I can't tell you how often on this show I've tried to explain to people what the mos maiorum is and how in the United States it's frayed. And when it frayed in the late Roman Republic and what was known as the Republican Revolution, that led to this sequence of terrible events that got progressively worse as people took greater and greater liberties with the way things that were done. What attracted you to this trajectory of disaster, Tom Holland? Why did you dive in first to the collapse of the Roman Republic after hundreds of years? It began cycling down really with Gaius Marius. You could argue the Gracchi brothers, but really with Marius. What drew you to that subject?
I think it's an amazing story. I think in some ways it's the most dramatic, the most exciting story that the political history has to offer. And I think there's a particular kind of quality of charisma and terror about Rome. It's kind of the apex predator of antiquity. It's the great white shark. It's the tyrannosaur. So there's an inherent fascination to it. But I think on top of that, the story that you get with the collapse of the Republic, in a way, is the kind of primal account of how politics works. That certainly, I mean, it haunts the United States. I think it haunts every Western country, every country that feels itself in some way to be descended from Rome. Because the book on which I write about is called Rubicon. And the phrase "to cross the Rubicon" means to take an irrevocable step, a step that once you've taken, you can't possibly go back. and it alludes to a small river in the north of Italy, which marked the boundary between Italy proper and the province of Gaul. And the governor of Gaul was Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar had been governor for 10 years, and he had spent those 10 years conquering the whole of Gaul, what is now France, crossing into Germany, crossing the Channel into Britain. They're amazing achievements. But his very greatness, the very scale of his achievements, the wealth, the glory that he had won, alarmed his enemies back in Rome, because they felt that he was putting the whole of the Republic in his shadow. And there were anxieties that he wanted to become a king of the kind that the Romans had thrown out centuries before. And so his enemies maneuvered to back him into a corner where essentially he was faced with the choice of either he would have to lay down his command, come to Rome, risk being prosecuted, and have his whole career ruined, or he could hold on to his command, lead his troops across the Rubicon into Italy, but that was so illegal that it would effectively be a declaration of civil war. So Caesar stands on the banks of the Rubicon, weighing these two alternatives up, and then he famously says, "The die is cast. I'm going to throw the dice, take this chance." He crosses the Rubicon, and sure enough, Rome does collapse into civil war. Caesar emerges victorious. He then gets assassinated. This precipitates another bout of civil war, and in the end, the person who emerges as the princeps, the first man, the imperator, the emperor, is Julius Caesar's great nephew, his adopted son, the man who takes on the name Augustus Caesar. And it's Augustus who then establishes an autocracy that endures until the very end of the Roman Empire.
Now,
and so that kind of that dividing line is the great dividing line in European politics and ultimately American politics, between republic, empire, between anarchy, if you like, and order, or between freedom and dictatorship.
It's also surrounded by an extraordinary decadence. As I read back to back, right? So I'm reading Rubicon. I finished it last night. I've been listening to. I have not quite finished the last few paragraphs of Nero, because you can't speed read a tape, right? You listen to it, and
right.
I'm struck by how absolutely decadent it is, and then I'm struck by your message of dominion, that the Christian world totally conquered the Roman decadence. It overturned everything that was depraved about Rome, and everything that was thought to be noble about Rome was put to shame. Shame didn't even exist actually as a other than an injury to honor. So that the triumph of Christianity that you outline in Dominion is actually in much greater relief if you've read Rubicon and Dynasty first. I think that's the order in which people should read your books. Do you agree?
Well, certainly how I came to write about Christianity was the growing feeling that Rome was unfathomably different. Incredibly alien. And the reason that we find it alien is basically whether you're a believing Christian or not, your assumptions and your morals have basically been Christianized. But what I would say about Rome is that absolutely, when you're dealing with figures like Caligula or Nero, I mean, they're bywords to this day. But I think they're complex characters and they're complex figures, and the relationship the Romans have to the idea of decadence is also complex, because we know about all these terrible things that the Romans are doing because the Romans themselves find them terrible. They are writing it up and saying these are terrible, terrible things. And we just have to look at our own society to see how that can operate. But we are obsessed by what the super rich do. We're obsessed by the excesses of those who have enormous wealth or power. That doesn't mean that we as a society are completely immoral. In fact, just the opposite. It means we have very high standards of morality. The Romans were the same. And in a sense, they are as moral as the Christians. It's just that the understanding of morality is very, very different.
Oh, it's so completely different. Later today, and I want to thank you for helping me prepare for this. I'm interviewing Mark Zuckerberg. I've never interviewed Mark before. I know him a little bit, and I've talked to him often, but I've never interviewed him before. But Silicon Valley is so much more easy to understand after you've taken a deep dive into Rome, because it's just the jockeying for auctoritas. It's just that all the bigs in Silicon Valley want to rule their virtual empire, right? They're all in competition with each other to be the first man in Silicon Valley, whether that's Jeff Bezos in Seattle or the head of Google or Mark Zuckerberg. It's a competition, but within rules, the rule of law that America established. In Rome, the whole Roman Revolution, it's so troubling that all the rules fall apart. And in rather rapid fashion, beginning, I guess, with Sulla's March on Rome, right?
Right. Yes.
And,
Well,
and
it's
go ahead.
It's interesting. Mark Zuckerberg's sister is actually a classicist, so it's obviously something
I didn't know that.
to be aware of.
Oh,
yeah. Donna Zuckerberg is a very eminent classicist. So there's obviously a kind of a family interest in this subject.
Oh, interesting.
Well,
I'll
there
bring that
must
up to him. You've helped me prepare
Yeah.
some more. But I do think it's a virtual empire, and all empires alike, and all empires dissimilar. I made a list, Tom Holland, last night after I was done with Rubicon. I just made a list. I said, okay, if I was going to do an in-depth kind of interview with Tom Holland, you haven't got enough time, and I don't. I'd have to cover Scipio Africanus, both Gracchi, Marius, Sulla, Cicero, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, Cato, Anthony, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Horace, Virgil, Seneca, and then two categories: the Roman mother and the Roman wife. That can't be done in a radio format. But you can lose yourself. I mean, you can absolutely lose yourself in this and still think you're talking about today.
These are incredibly vivid characters who continue to have a resonance. I mean, everyone's heard of Julius Caesar, everyone's heard of Cleopatra, everyone's heard of Caligula. These are names that continue to kind of haunt us, and I think that's what makes the story so astonishing. They're painted in such vivid colors, and they shed such deep shadows that it's almost impossible to read it and not feel completely gripped. And especially, as I said, because to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, the fact that we always have this feeling that perhaps there are lessons for our own society. I mean, I think you can overdo that. But the fact that America is a republic founded on the model of the Roman Republic does mean that there's a kind of nervousness
Absolutely.
about the possibility of a new Caesar emerging, whether that's a Mark Zuckerberg, a Jeff Bezos, a Trump, or whoever. The anxiety about the kind of alpha male who puts the whole of the republic in his shadow is something that America shares with Rome.
I'm also in reading the Rubicon book, not Dynasty. George Washington's favorite play was Joseph Addison's Cato. And so you spend a lot of time on Cato and Rubicon. I'm glad you do, because Cato is often overlooked. I bet you not 1 in 1,000 Americans that are listening to me know who Cato is. And that's okay, because no one took 4 years of Latin or Greek when they were in high school anymore. Nobody does it. But Cato, Washington would watch that play again and again and again. And of course, that had to frame how he conducted the first presidency. And the first presidency frames how the presidency has been conducted since.
Well, there's that amazing statue in the Smithsonian where you've got Washington in his wig and a toga.
Yes.
It's such a kind of bizarre look, and yet it absolutely expresses what you say. And Cato is, I think, again a figure who's very familiar to us. He's the man of rigid, almost authoritarian virtue, who refuses to cut his opponents any slack, and who is so determined to affirm the primacy of the Roman Republic that on one notorious occasion, he's very, as a Republican, he's very contemptuous of kings and foreign kings. And the emissary of a foreign king comes to greet him when he's got an official in Cyprus, and he insists on meeting the envoy while he's on the toilet.
Yes.
That kind of perfectly sums up the kind of rather crude quality of virtue that he was all about.
But he was absolutely insistent on the rule of law, the Constitution as we would understand it. It was unwritten like the British Constitution, but he insisted upon it. And there are people like him still. They're often extreme in the Senate and the House of the United States. I'm sure you've got them. In fact, I think your leader of the House right now is a Cato-like character in love with the past. But there are also so many Ciceros around. What you do a good job of taking your schoolboy Cicero and turning him from being a great orator into being rather a two-faced backbone lacking, occasionally dynamic, and in the end glorious kind of person, but so multidimensional that never comes through.
Well, Cicero is, I mean, he's still a name to play with. I remember people would compare Obama's oratory, say it's Ciceronian, and it had that quality. And Cicero remains a kind of byword for eloquence to this day.
Yes.
And he would have been so thrilled by that because he was quite astonishingly vain. And there's a wonderful letter where he says, I wonder what people will say about me in 1,000 years' time. Absolutely confident that people will be talking about him in 1,000 years' time. And yet here we are, 2,000 years on, and we're still talking about him. And I think the reason for that isn't just that he was a great orator, so he establishes the template for rhetoric. But in a way, he's a very, very human representative of what it is to be a politician who is trying to square ideals with the brute realities of how a state at a time of crisis functions. And we know this because we've got loads of his speeches, but also we've got loads of his letters. And this gives us kind of incredible detail. So Cicero will describe what the weather's like on a certain day. He'll complain about how there are cracks in his, in the plaster of his villa, things like that. So that level of detail. But at the same time, we can see all his hopes, all his ambitions crumbling. And then right at the end, in the wake of Caesar's assassination, where he's trying to keep the Republic going as a functioning, living thing, he dares to stand up to Julius Caesar's great deputy, Mark Antony, and abuses him. I mean, the abuse you get on Twitter has nothing on what the abuse that Cicero levels at Mark Antony. And it goes wrong, and Mark Antony gets his vengeance. Cicero has his throat cut. His head is delivered to Mark Antony's wife, who yanks out Cicero's tongue, takes out her hairpins, and stabs them through the tongue that had delivered all the abuse against him, against her and her husband.
There are moments of such brutality. Caesar cutting off 10,000 hands. Doesn't that ring as just history's most awful echo of a tyrant? To cut off 10,000 hands?
And to be praised for it, because Caesar is doing this because a Gallic tribe that had submitted to Rome has rebelled, and so people regard this as something admirable, an affirmation of Roman dignity. And in a way, I think that is what really brings home just how different they are, because the way we've been talking, the parallels are very clear, and you might be tempted into thinking, well, essentially these are people like us. They're really not like
They're
us.
not.
They're very, very different. They're very different. And in a way, it's said of Julius Caesar that when he conquered Gaul, this great achievement that provided him with the launch pad for becoming the master of the entire Roman world, he slaughtered 1 million Gauls and he enslaved another. Now, those figures may be exaggerated, but even if they are, that's a near genocidal quality of brutality, and yet we remember Caesar as a hero. And
in fact, I was going to ask you about this. On page 307 of Rubicon, you write, and I made a big note about this, there was no one capable of inspiring a more passionate devotion to troops than Caesar. Amid all the confusion of war, it had become perhaps the surest measure of his greatness. And I made a note to myself, so Tom Holland is admitting Caesar is great. So I have to ask him, what does it mean to be great? Because it certainly doesn't mean to be great in the Christian world to be as Caesar was.
No.
But in history's march, Mao was great, Stalin was great. But dare we say that? I mean, because they make great impact, but they're horrible people.
Well, great by the standards of Rome. Every society has its own standards, and so every society has its standards of what are great, and those standards may well be contested, and certainly they were contested, in Caesar's own time. There were plenty who stood up to him. That's why a civil war was fought. But by the standards of Rome, which regarded great conquests, great feats of endurance and bloodshed as markers of a great citizen, Caesar was indisputably great by those standards. And on top of that, he was great as a man who reformed the calendar. as a writer, as an administrator. He was a man of remarkable talent, and in a way, it was the sheer heft of his talent that made him so feared.
Now, Tom, I don't know if you're moving, if you move in the same circles as N.T. Wright, if you read N.T. Wright, but I have moved on from your books.
Yes.
Okay, so I've moved on to N.T. Wright's History and Eschatology, Jesus and the Promise of Natural Theology, the argument of which is complex, but boils down to that nature confirms the teaching of Christ, that there is such a thing as natural theology, there is such a thing as natural law. But if that's the case, the Romans ignored it all. Because the natural theology that N.T. Wright celebrates would not tolerate this sort of evil.
Well, we call it evil because our standards have become Christian, and so we think in terms of good and evil. I don't think the Romans thought in those terms, and I think in a way, the assumption that the strong should have their way and the weak just have to lump it is actually a far more natural assumption than the idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, which frankly is quite an odd notion and a rather counterintuitive one.
But it's Wright's argument, and I'm just teasing it out. I've read his earlier stuff, and I've just begun History and Eschatology, is that the very creation that we are surrounded by and the very people that we are, Tom Holland and Hugh Hewitt talking, indicates a level of morality and a way. We know that it's wrong to cut off 10,000 hands. We know that it is a terrible thing to sleep with your sister, which pretty much every Caesar does, or to leave your wife and abandon your children and have everyone executed in the line opposite you so no one can. That we know this. That's the argument that N.T. Wright is making. You have now studied both societies. Do you believe he's right?
I don't.
How interesting.
I don't. But then he's a theologian and a bishop, former bishop. So he, of course, would think that because he sees the expression of the Christian God in everything that he studies. Whereas I would look at it and I would say the measure of how revolutionary and transformative Christianity is actually that by the standards of most civilization, it's very odd, because I think it's far more natural for the strong to have their way, for the strong to kick sand in the faces of the weak. And that's very much what the Romans did. It's not to say that the Romans were entirely predatory. We talked about Cato as a figure upholding the traditional standards of Roman morality. And Cato was anxious that Caesar's campaigns against the Gauls were presumptuous and would offend the gods. And in fact, Cato proposed that Caesar be handed over to the Germans for launching an unprovoked attack on them. I mean, of course, nobody took it seriously, but I suppose Cato would be, I don't know.
But Cato would have believed in the liberties that an owner could take with a slave that you detail. Cato would have been completely comfortable with that which Lincoln could not abide, the idea that all men are created unequal. He would have accepted that most primitive of institutions. And so they're very different from us.
Absolutely. But everybody did accept that. I mean, it was pretty much a given that slavery was just kind of, like disease. It was just something that existed. What was the problem with it? It's only very, very recently that people have just kind of swung to the opposite pole and assumed that slavery is absolutely an evil. And that is why the study of history is so fascinating, because you realize that things that you take for granted in the here and now are actually very contingent, that there are many, many different ways to be human. And more than that, there are many, many different ways to think that you are doing the right thing.
That is, I think, the revelation of that's the revelation of these three books read back to back to back, is that everything is contingent, and that Christianity's triumph over the West may not be as lasting as anyone thinks. We could easily be dominated by the Confucian system. We could easily find out that the new Rome is Beijing, not Washington, D.C., and that all of our moralism is transitory. Because, I mean, if Rome could fall, after you write it up this way, Tom, what couldn't fall? I mean, that used to be said about Sparta. Sparta only lasted 600 years. How can any republic last longer than that? Is there anything that you would look to in Roman history to encourage people that in the long run we do reach the end of history, to quote Francis Fukuyama, and we end up with a natural law? Is there anything in the Roman experience that would do that for you?
I think that to assume that there is a natural law, that there is a right way of doing things, is a leap of faith. It's a kind of it's a theological assumption. Obviously, you can believe that. N.T. Wright does, but then, as I said, he's a former bishop. He's a Christian theologian, and in a sense, to take that leap of faith, whether you become a Christian, whether you believe in human rights, whether you believe that the arc of justice proceeds a certain way, these are all things that are rooted in faith. If you can't take that leap of faith, then I think when you look at the swirl and churn of history, I think you're left with the perhaps possibly bleak conclusion that there is no one right way of doing things, and that every civilization has understood things in quite significant ways. So the question about whether, say, America is doomed to fall, which is one that has been haunting Americans since the very founding of the Republic, that again is because this idea that Rome fell. And every Western empire has had that anxiety. Because Rome fell, therefore power is transitory. But you mentioned Beijing. Beijing is the capital of a Chinese empire. It wasn't the original one. There have been many different capitals. But there's always been an idea of China as a coherent entity that ultimately goes back to the age of Rome, to the time of Rome. China has been conquered many times. It's fallen apart. It's been reconstituted. And yet it's recognizably the same imperial state in a way that, say, modern Europe is not recognizably the heir of Rome. So I think people in Europe and America are haunted by the idea that empires must inevitably fall in a way that, say, the Chinese tend not to be.
Oh, in Dr. Kissinger's book and in Graham Allison's book, they quote the famous phrase, "That which is unified must divide, and that which must divide, and that which is divided must unify." There is no founding myth of the Chinese Empire, because their founding myth, the Yellow Emperor, actually presumes a prior history which is not articulate. They're so old, they don't have a founding. They don't have a Romulus. They don't have an Aeneas. They're so old that it does confront the West with the idea that we've always hung on to Rome as being the founding great empire. Nah, not really. We just didn't have a grasp of the globe or of history. So as a historian, have you come to the same conclusion? No, 2,000 years from now, we'll look back and know that we will have utterly transformed again?
Who knows? I think there's a kind of certainly I feel it, that history is speeding up. You mentioned Francis Fukuyama saying that the history had come to a stop. In a way, in the 21st century, it felt like everything is going so fast. And in many ways, what's happening is a response to, I think, the processes of globalization and industrialization. So the onset of COVID-19 is obviously become a pandemic because the world is so interconnected. Likewise, if global temperatures are rising, then we can't begin to understand or to predict what the consequences of that may be. So I think that it's almost impossible to know what the world will look like in 2,000 years' time, whether even Homo sapiens will be here.
So you're not much of a believer in the singularity. I heard what you just said very clearly, and as a Christian, it doesn't trouble me because that's actually the end of the story. But the singularity on the secular side is everything comes together and figures it out, and you don't believe that.
No, I live in a country that was part of an entity founded in the wake of the worst tyranny that our continent ever saw, and it was the European Union was an attempt to ensure that never again would wars be fought in that way. And most of my life, I assumed that the European Union would be something that progressed and would grow, but certainly wouldn't fall apart. So I I, I now have to live with the recognition that I called that one badly wrong. But absolutely, things can fall apart because my country has now left the European Union, and who knows what the impact of COVID-19 on Europe will be, or indeed on other parts of the world as well. I mean, that is something that has literally come from nowhere. This time 6 months ago, who would have predicted that we'd be here? And yet here we are.
Yeah, vanity is vanity, always is vanity. I want to close by talking about the Jews because I find your aside about them when Nero blames Christians and Jews and various immigrants to have resonance in our current era where outsiders are being blamed for a lot, like COVID-19 is being blamed on the Chinese, and people want to blame things like that. But it did remind me that back in the day when Nero played his lyre and was an actor, there were these communities of people that stood apart from the Roman way, and they endured and the Romans didn't. I think N.T. Wright might throw that up as an argument for the natural theology that we do know a natural order.
I always remember the scene in The Sopranos where Tony Soprano and his gang are menacing a body of Orthodox Jews who haven't paid their debts, and one of them starts talking about Masada and saying, "The Jews are still here. Where are the Romans?" Tony Soprano says, "You're looking at them.
You're looking."
Well, so in that sense, but absolutely, I think that one of the great themes of Roman history is exactly the way in which actually the Romans do recognize that the Jews are kind of cuckoos in the nest, that they're distinctive, and they're distinctive in a way that many Romans find unsettling, but they're also distinctive in a way that many Romans find highly interesting and appealing. And one of the reasons that Nero probably is alert to the existence of Christians as potential scapegoats for the fire of Rome is that his wife, Poppaea Sabina, incredibly glamorous figure who 2,000 years before Pete Townsend said that she hoped she died before she grew old, and
yes.
really did. She was very sympathetic to the Jews. She was a kind of, she wanted to believe in the Jewish God, but couldn't because she wasn't Jewish. But she if someone to that degree at the very heart of Roman power was interested in Jewish teachings and the Jewish example, it suggests that there was a kind of open door there, if not for Jews, then certainly for Christians to push at. And so, of course, in the long run, it proves.
It did. Let me close by asking about the study of history. Do you have any hope for a renaissance of interest in Rome? Obviously, you've written some bestsellers that have been very well received by people like me and people like NPR. And people love to read good history written in a rollicking kind of way so that it's fun, it's not dusty, it's full of wild details. You use the vernacular where it is useful to use the vernacular. Do you see a renaissance in interest in the Roman Republic? Because it's always fascinated me, but I'm an outlier. I assume you are as well. Is there any hope for that coming back?
Well, the idea of a renaissance, a rebirth, is actually something that's been going on pretty much since the Roman Empire fell. You have cycles of people rediscovering it, renewing their interest in it. And I think that particular periods will bring the example of Rome into a kind of focus. So I actually wrote Rubicon against the backdrop of 9/11 and the Iraq War. And that was definitely a time when people were pretty interested in Rome.
Yes.
Gladiator had come out in the year 2000. And then in the wake of 9/11, with America planning to invade the Middle East, the Imperial Republic, I remember it was very difficult to find a cartoon that didn't show George Bush in a toga with a laurel wreath. The idea that America was Rome was very, very prevalent there. And I think at the moment, with the tensions around the Trump presidency, again, there's quite a lot of interest in the idea of how the Republic fell. People who are very opposed to Trump are quite keen on labeling him as a kind of a particularly sinister Caesar.
Yeah, and I always
people who
I push back at that,
Uh,
Tom, because I just think that's so silly given his desires are so limited. He does not violate he's not like Sula, he's not marching on DC. He's abided by
but
every court order. He's just not sinister in the least.
of course. I mean, I don't think that the parallels are remotely exact, but in a way that's irrelevant because it's just that Rome is so omnipresent in people's imagination that they will reach for it. It's part of
Yeah.
the kind of the abuse that people will automatically reach for, and in doing that, they are doing something that Americans have been doing since the very beginning of the Republic. The accusations that get leveled against Trump are pretty much identical to the kind of accusations that got leveled against Andrew Jackson, who
Yeah.
likewise was accused of being a wannabe Caesar. Um, the American Republic survived Andrew Jackson. I'm sure it will survive.
There have
Trump
really
as well.
only been a handful of Caesar. I mean, Caesarism is itself a disease of men like Napoleon and I would say Mao and Hitler who think they can have it all and run the whole world. Maybe this what you mentioned earlier that we are advancing so quickly, history speeding up. Maybe that will diminish the temptation to people to think that because no one can master a world this complicated. It, it I assume that you'll have in your mind Marcus Crassus or someone like that who thinks they can have it all and do it their way.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I want to thank you. Great books. And what should I read in the Holland canon? What should I read after going Dominion, Rubicon, Dynasty? What's next?
Well, you could look at Persian Fire, which is a book about the Persian invasion of Greece in 490, which was defeated at the Battle of Marathon, and then in 480, which is the Battle of Thermopylae and Salamis.
That's looking backwards. Does something follow
if
chronologically? Yeah.
Okay, if you want to go forwards, then another period very much in which Persia, Iran is very important, is a book I wrote called In the Shadow of the Sword,
Yes.
which is about how Roman and Persian power collapsed and left a space for the Arab Empire, which gives birth to Islam, to step into the breach. And it's a book that was quite controversial because I argued that the traditional Muslim understanding of who Muhammad was and where Islam came from is actually a bit of a myth. So you can imagine.
That's where I'm going next. I'm going to In the Shadow of the Sword.
Keen on that.
And when I'm done with that, I'll call you again and trouble you again. I appreciate so much, Tom Holland, the time.
It would be an honor. Thanks very much for having me back.
Thanks for coming back. Bye-bye.